Mark Goldberg with the UN Affairs blog UN Dispatch, talking today to Don Kraus from Citizens for Global Solutions. We're going to sort of survey the legislative landscape in terms of American policy towards international institutions, international treaties, and international law, and sort of see how the new administration and new Congress sort of will approach these things. Maybe by way of introduction, Don, you can explain sort of what Citizens for Global Solutions is and sort of your role there.
Sure. Citizens for Global Solutions is a national membership organization. We have about 30,000 members, activists around the country who really seek to answer the questions, how can nations work together to solve global problems that they can't solve on their own? From genocide to climate change to nuclear proliferation, there's all these problems with passports that no nation, no matter how powerful, could really resolve on its own. So, that's what we work on. How do nations get together and resolve these? And more importantly, at least from our perspective, what's the United States policy towards this? Mm-hmm. So we find ourselves in a really very interesting and exciting time right now.
So I think sort of probably regular viewers will recognize from your description of your organization that sort of we probably share a lot of similar views on these issues. You, however, have your ear, I think, very close to the sort of legislative street in terms of where these issues stand in Congress and in Washington in general. And I feel like I should also issue a disclaimer in that, so we've known each other for a long time. I don't know if you know this, Don, but I quoted you in my first ever article for the American Prospect magazine.
I remember that.
But currently I'm working on a short consultancy project with Citizens for Global Solutions, and I should put that out there now. And maybe we can move on. And I wanted to maybe start by asking you about the Law of the Sea, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. It's something I spoke at length about with your former colleague Scott Paul on this program probably about 8 or 9 months ago now. But I was hoping maybe you could explain to viewers what Law of the Sea is and where it stands in terms of sort of U.S. policy towards it and sort of why you think it's important.
Sure. The Law of the Sea Convention is a very broad, sweeping multilateral treaty that really looks at what are the different rules of the roads that nations will have regarding use of the oceans as well as territorial claim over the oceans. It sets overall boundaries of how far out a nation's economic zone could go. It has policy regarding migratory fish stock, land-based fish stock, land-based pollutions of the seas, rights of free passage, and many other issues that really kind of just set a basic set of framework, a groundwork for how nations utilize this global common, our oceans, are 2/3 of the Earth's surface. It's a convention that is in force, and the United States is the largest nation that has a huge amount of sea space along the oceans. That really has not yet ratified this convention. But the breadth and support for U.S. ascension to this treaty is incredible, actually. From environmental organizations and, peace and security organizations like Citizens for Global Solutions, to the extractive industries, the oil companies and the fishing and shipping, to telecommunications companies that, have, undersea cable, and also, our military as well. Our Navy is very, very much interested in U.S. ratification of this because it really sets down some rules about passage and who could go where on the oceans. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce supports that, so there's broad support. But it is a treaty that we have not yet ratified, and it's something that I would like to believe that early on in an Obama administration that it's something that could be taken up. Probably not in the first few months as Congress reorganizes itself, as nominations go through Senate Foreign Relations and onto the Senate floor for the UN ambassador, for the Secretary of State, and other important positions. But once some of this housekeeping and the setting up of the new administration is taken care of, It's something that very early on we would like to see Congress move on. It would have to once again go through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It's already passed there twice, and then on to the Senate floor. There actually was a majority of Senate support for it in the last Congress. There just wasn't time in the agenda as well as some political will, considering that the elections were coming up, to get it forward. So I think it's a time for this to happen. And one of the reasons why this is so important is that there are many other multilateral treaties that the U.S. is going to be interested in taking a look at, from the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty to some of the human rights treaties like the Women's Convention, CEDAW, to perhaps even the International Criminal Court Treaty, as well as a climate change convention or protocol that would be coming up after the meeting in Copenhagen towards the end of the year. So there's lots of this kind of business, and really the U.S. is kind of out of shape. It's out of practice in terms of ratifying and kind of taking in these multilateral conventions. It's been quite a while. So this would be a good place to start.
I have sort of two, I guess, technical questions about the treaty. First, mm-hmm. Why is it that environmentalists support it, and why do sort of the mineral extraction people, the sort of deep sea mining people, support it?
Sure. Well, for some of the same reasons, actually. The reason that environmentalists support this is because it really takes, this huge amount of undersea territory that then becomes under a nation's economic and closer in sovereign control, and really puts it underneath the environmental guidelines and regulations that we function with. So it really sets up environmental rules for a broad swath of territory that doesn't exist. For the extractive industries, it allows for them to have a clear understanding of what leases they actually control on the seabed, both within a 200-mile limit and then also on the outside of that 200-mile limit. And for them to often put hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to put in these deep-sea wells, having that certainty, that legitimacy there, it really makes it necessary for them to get the financing and the funding to be able to do these projects. But it also puts them within these environmental framework, and they'd rather function within those frameworks than outside of them, and with an uncertainty of what could come down in the future. So from both sides, both from the environmentalists and for the extractive industries, it really creates some amount of certainty, of knowledge of how the rules of the road will work.
So I guess if this broad coalition supports it, why hasn't it been passed? I mean, it was, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sort of has its roots in the Reagan administration. And
sure, it actually has its roots earlier, even in the Nixon administration. Mm-hmm. It was in Reagan where the treaty was actually finally signed. The U.S. was one of 4 nations at that point that did not sign it. There was concern on the part of the Reagan administration that some of the way it's set up, this thing called the Seabed Authority, the International Seabed Authority, really, for them, they thought was not good for business and not good for U.S. sovereignty. During Bush 1, this was changed. It was amended to the satisfaction of the Bush 1 administration, and then under Clinton, we signed onto the treaty. And however, at that point, Jesse Helms became chair of Senate Foreign Relations. He said, "No way is this coming through my committee here." Once he left and Senator Lugar took over the committee, it actually, Senator Lugar, a former Navy man, is a very, very strong, probably one of the strongest supporters of the treaty in the Senate. So he moved it forward in his committee. It passed unanimously in 2004, but at that point could not make it to the floor. It was still a Republican majority, and there was a lot of opposition there. And some of this opposition comes from individuals who really feel if it's multilateral, if it has the words UN in it, they will oppose it. And they're able to really get people to write letters, make phone calls, and make it politically difficult to just be able to look at this treaty just on its merits. And this happened once again in 2007. There's feeling that the Senate will not pass a controversial treaty. There was White House support, but not really strong support. The President Bush signed off on it. He actually stipulated his support in writing. But he really wouldn't work it, and he didn't put a lot of oomph behind it. And the reality is, you need a White House that's willing to push, willing to work in order to get any kind of large multilateral treaty convention passed through our Senate.
And so this will require, correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't read my Constitution in a while, but is it 70 votes to pass a treaty?
67, two-thirds.
Okay, 67 votes, two-thirds. Mm-hmm. With, I suppose there's still one Senate seat at time of recording that's still up in the air, the Minnesota Senate seat. But have there been sort of any notable sort of changes or shifts in the Senate, people coming, people leaving, that might make you more optimistic that the 67 number can be reached?
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, Tom Udall coming on in New Mexico, Mark Udall coming on in Colorado are both ones where there was some opposition and some concern. North Carolina is another one. I don't see any change in terms of New Hampshire. Sununu was supportive. Same thing. Gordon Smith was relatively supportive. In Oregon. We'll have to see what happens on that Minnesota race. Senator Coleman was one of the ones who opposed it in committee, so that could make a difference over there. Overall, if you look at the numbers, we already had on both sides of the aisle enough support actually to meet that 67 number. I think the number is even higher now.
Okay, but what it requires then is not just the support, but sort of the Senate Majority Leader bringing it to the floor for a vote? I guess technically, how would this happen?
Okay, so it will once the Senate Foreign Relations Committee reorganizes itself, we assume under Senator Kerry's chairmanship, it would need to come through the committee, be voted on once again in committee. Hopefully, since they just had hearings on this not too long ago, they wouldn't have to go through that process again, but my guess is they probably would. And then at that point, it would be able to come to the Senate floor as long as Senator Reid was willing. Senator Biden was very supportive of this, so his role as vice president, I think would play a very strong role within the Democratic caucus to move this forward, as well as some of his staff that was working with him on committee and has a very, long institutional memory about this process. Our assumption is we'll be with him in the White House as well. That will be helpful as well.
I wonder, actually, if I can probe that for just a second, because, my impression was that, Biden was not sort of supportive of these issues, but he actually sort of knew them pretty well and knew the process very well and was more than supportive, but was sort of active in sort of advocating them. I assume Kerry is supportive of these, but I don't get the sense that he is he doesn't have sort of the history, I guess, of actively, proactively going after, asking for hearings on these kinds of issues. And I wonder if sort of paradoxically, perhaps, sort of Biden's promotion to vice president might sort of hurt this, and not only this, but some of the other issues you raised, like the CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty as well. Again, because he and his sort of Senate staff kind of knew these issues in and out. Sure.
I think some of it's going to depend upon who's the staff that Kerry brings on to the committee with him. How serious does he take the committee? One would hope that he will take it very seriously. And specifically in terms of the law, the C Convention, Senator Lugar, the ranking member on the committee, will continue, I think, to push and urge to move this forward. My guess is because of the way the Senate functions that Senator Kerry will be okay with that. And in many ways might learn some from Senator Lugar on it. There's a lot of bipartisanship on that committee, and I see this because of the broad bipartisan support for this, as well as the theme of bipartisanship that seems to be happening throughout the Obama administration, and hopefully the trickle-down effect that will have into the Senate, that we'll be able to see, some strong and early support for ratification.
Mm-hmm. But Are you? I mean, are you optimistic at all? Or are you? It seems that this is kind of one of those issues that, in the wake of so many other issues like the global financial crisis and Afghanistan and so many other things that clutter the Senate schedule, that sort of getting this on might be difficult.
Yeah, actually, I am kind of optimistic about it. There is, an urge for the U.S. to reintroduce itself to the world. I think there's going to be a desire for this administration to show some substantive multilateral effort to really say, hey, we're back, and we want to re-engage in international law, and we want to re-engage in working as a partner with other nations. And this would be a pretty good bipartisan way of going ahead and really, showing that. So would it happen in the first 100 days? Probably not. Within the first year of an administration, I'd say there's a good possibility of that.
All right. Well, we'll come back a year from now and check back, hopefully.
Okay.
Maybe we can move on to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, because that's another one of those lingering treaties that correct me if I'm wrong, has been signed but not passed. Maybe you can sort of give me a brief, or give the viewers a brief history lesson, I guess, of what the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is.
Sure. This is a treaty that really just limits. It's an agreement where nations will not test nuclear weapons. It's very simple, as its name implies. And this was a treaty that actually, during the Clinton administration, there was strong support to have it ratified. And it was actually brought to the floor and defeated on the floor of the Senate. It did not pass.
When was that?
So this was in 94 or 95.
Okay.
And so there's. So it's beyond just a treaty that was just been languishing. It's a treaty that actually the Senate already put their thumbs down on. However, candidate Obama said this is one of the treaties that he's interested in being able to move forward. And he, has really talked about nuclear proliferation as really something that is dangerous and something that his administration does want to put some focus and energy into. So taking a look at this treaty and moving it forward, I believe, is something that will see some priority early on from the White House.
And what? So, I mean, do you see? So you said it was defeated in '94. Clearly, it was under different circumstances. But do you see the Senate being more supportive of it now, and new people, new faces?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in terms of the increase in the size of the Democratic majority. Of course, you still need 67, but there has been bipartisan support, and there's certainly very, very strong support amongst Americans for us to be able to sign on to this treaty. There really always has been. So the numbers are better. I haven't really studied and gotten down into the whip count detailed on this particular one. In terms of how strong that support is. Do we have the 67? I can't tell you as strongly as I can with the Law of the Sea Convention. I can tell you in terms of candidate questionnaires from many of the new Senate candidates coming on in that we have talked with, that there was support for taking up this treaty. So I would say that it is something that's doable.
And sort of, I guess, where's the opposition to this treaty, and sort of what do they say, or is there is it one of those things where people just aren't paying attention to it, so there's no opposition, or is one of the reasons it hasn't been introduced and that people are sort of actively opposed to a U.S. ascension?
Well, there's not very vocal opposition right now. It's under the radar. Mm-hmm. No one has really said, let's take it up. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there will be opposition, if it gets seriously moving forward. The opposition will be is that, for those who say, well, we need to continue testing our nuclear weapons as we develop new generations of them, that we need to make sure that they function correctly and work correctly. Balancing that on the other side is, a Democratic and a strong Democratic majority in the Senate now, and a plank in the Democratic platform that says we really want to abolish the use of nuclear weapons. So, just a simple limiting of our testing of them certainly would be a step in that direction. Perhaps there might be some steps prior to taking up ratifications such as a new bilateral agreement with Russia to draw down the number of nuclear weapons, or even perhaps a unilateral decrease in the number of them, or some sort of confidence building and moving us in that direction. It may not be the first thing that happens in terms of an Obama administration really trying to push this agenda of decreasing the threat of nuclear weapons, but it certainly will remain on the list of to-dos.
Maybe we can now sort of shift to the International Criminal Court. I take it that you don't think that sort of the United States will ratify the Rome Statute, the sort of ICC's treaty. It's called the Rome Statute. Anytime soon, is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think it's a little early in the process. The court is still relatively new. It was it's a first human rights institution established in the century. In 2002 is when it finally got up and running. It has a few cases that it's considering right now in Sudan, in Uganda, in Darfur. But it really hasn't worked any of these cases all the ways through to the end yet. And I think it's going to take a few of these trials and a little bit more getting used to the court before the U.S. is really to take a serious look at its own ratification. However, there's many steps that have already started to take place and could take place in even to a greater degree within an Obama administration for the U.S. to be more cooperative with the court. For it, first off, to reverse the Bush administration policy, which was very negative, which had a policy of a bilateral immunity campaign, where it basically imposed economic sanctions on nations that would not sign an agreement with the U.S. That it would give immunity to all U.S. citizens and personnel and contractors from any jurisdiction of the court. And by and large, the Senate has pretty well repealed or not renewed any of the House and the Senate, any of these kind of economic sanctions. So we've stepped away from that. There has been a cooperation, particularly in the situation in Darfur, of the U.S. With the court, even under the Bush administration, although at a very quiet and low level. So I think we'll see within an Obama administration this a little bit more above board and out front, perhaps, and we hope that there will be a high-level U.S. observer to the Assembly of State Parties, the governing body of the treaty, in the very near future. There's always a seat there for the U.S., and there's always this empty seat there for the U.S. in all these different meetings. So just to have a U.S. Official sit down there would be a very good and strong step forward, particularly because there's a review conference for the treaty scheduled in 2010, where they're going to take up one of the crimes under the court's jurisdiction that's been put on hold, and that's the crime of aggression. And it's because it was put on hold because there was no definition for aggression. So this will be one of the things to be considered in 2010. The U.S. certainly is going to be interested in this. And so we hope that there will be this much greater level of cooperation. And then in due time, after some experience, after some success of the court in terms of how it functions, I think at that point we could take a look at ratification. But we have some intermediate steps between now and then.
Can I follow up on this idea of the review conference and aggression? Because that's I don't know, it seems kind of interesting. So I guess in the charter of the International Criminal Court, you will not find a crime called aggression. So like the ICC prosecutor can't prosecute a country, a head of state, for committing an act of aggression. Is that right?
Well, actually, aggression was mentioned
okay.
As one of the crimes in the jurisdiction in the treaty, but they said, but we're not going to actually, initiate this or activate this until there's a clear definition. And some of the things that needs to be worked out is what's, the role of the Security Council, because that's the place where, issues of peace and security happen and are decided what's their role in determining if something is it aggression or not. and how do we define it? The creators of the treaty said, let's hold off on this one until we're really clear on it. So it's been scheduled for 2010. So this conversation, this preparatory groups already talking and discussing this. This will heat up in 2009, and we'd like to see the U.S. there and play a very constructive role in those conversations.
See, now, I guess last time this question, right, of whether to include aggression or not was discussed was in sort of negotiations under the Clinton administration, I would presume, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't imagine the United States would be sort of supportive of wanting to sort of closely define or probably more broadly define the crime of aggression for fear that as sort of the world superpower, it might sort of perhaps be more open to being accused of committing aggression. Is that right?
Well, I think you'll see the U.S. Along with other P5 nations. I think it will be not so much should this be a crime or not. Should we come to consensus on what the definition is? I think particularly for P5 members, the question is going to be what's the role of the Security Council? Is the Security Council the one that actually says, aha, this is aggression, and then the court could actually take some action? Which I think there'll be a lot of controversy in that, particularly considering the role of the veto within the Security Council. And that's, I think, where some of the dividing lines of the debate will be.
And probably the big elephant in the room is sort of the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq, which was not Security Council sanctioned. One would presume.
I mean, that will be one of the things. Of course, the court never looks at things retroactively, so it wouldn't be able to go back. But it would think. I'm sure the U.S. and others would think about what happens on the next one of these, and will there be a situation where that might indeed happen, that the Security Council could say this is aggression. So
sorry, that was a bit of a digression. I thought it was kind of interesting though.
Sure.
All right, so we covered. We talked about Law of the Sea, ICC, and Tasmanian Treaty. Are there any other sort of multilateral treaties that sort of floating out there that sort of
there's certainly a lot.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there's other treaties that are being considered, talked about, from small arms conventions to conventions on cluster munitions and an arms trade convention. We haven't really discussed the climate change treaty, but I think beyond just talking about treaties, I think we ought to talk a little bit also about the role of the U.S. with the United Nations and how this might work out, particularly considering our new UN ambassador, Susan Rice.
Mm-hmm. Now, I don't. So last week on this program, my regular sparring partner, this guy Matthew Lee, who's a blogger and reporter from the UN. I gave him my full opinion of Susan Rice, which is very positive. I imagine yours is probably similar, but go ahead.
Sure. And I think she is someone, considering her experience with, as the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, and she was one of the very early people who came on into Rwanda and saw the bodies and saw what happened because of a genocide, and became very, very angry about it. And I think we will see this passion directed towards a greater U.S. resolve towards dealing with the situation in Darfur, dealing with the situation in the Congo, and I think it will be very, very good for not only the U.S. but for the United Nations as well to have this kind of high-level intelligence and passion in a U.S. representative on these issues. So I think that will be very positive. That said. There's going to be a desire, and President-elect Obama has already talked about seeing the UN as a very important but imperfect institution, and needing to be able to push a reform agenda at the UN. But there's not clarity yet as to what exactly that reform agenda will be. Will it be the kind of let's do the books better, let's manage it better, or will it take some serious looks at Security Council reform, how we do peacekeeping. Is it time for the U.S. to put blue helmets back on and get re-engaged at that level? So I think there's a lot of very important questions to be asked as to what will the role of the U.S. be within the UN. Will we, particularly considering the financial situation, be able to catch up on the some $1.3 to $6 billion that we currently owe the UN in terms of funds? Will that be moved forward? Will we finally put a cap, get rid of the cap on peacekeeping, so we're actually paying on a permanent basis what we're being assessed? There's a lot to be able to take care of here, but I think we have a very good team that's going into place to be able to work on it.
So that question you raised about whether or not sort of when Obama says sort of UN reform, whether he means sort of big structural, let's reform the Security Council, or whether he means let's like you said, do the books better, let's implement some management reforms. When you look at sort of Obama's team of advisors, does sort of, are you tipped one way or the other as to what he might be sort of alluding to?
Mm-hmm. I think there's actually going to be some of both. Mm-hmm. We have a very pragmatic team here. I think there's certainly going to be a desire for greater transparency within the UN. There'll be greater desire in terms of how it does function and manage itself. The reality is there's been a lot of progress made within the UN over the last number of years, particularly since the 2005 summit that really pushed a lot of these reform issues. So there's been a lot of positive steps, and I think it's important to keep that process going, and we'll see that. But I think we'll also see some of the questions of, well, how do we do civilian protection better? If this UN cannot react to genocide, if it cannot react to mass killings, to aggression, then it's going to continue to lose credibility. And I see a desire on the part of the U.S. to be able to really keep it as a credible institution. Yeah. That said, an Ambassador Rice is going to be one who will try, I think, very, very hard to get consensus and to get the UN to agree to take action when required, but also one not afraid to say if the UN is locked up, if it's not going to take action, that the U.S. could very well take unilateral action.
Mm-hmm. And people seem to forget. She maybe a year and a half ago, or probably even 2 years by now, she wrote an op-ed, I think, for the Washington Post. Probably co-wrote with some. She
did it with Anthony Lake and with Don Payne.
Okay, and sorry. Go ahead.
Sure, and this is basically, they called for the U.S. to take unilateral action in Sudan to stop the killing, to be able to, from anywhere from no-fly zones to actually, taking out some Sudanese installations.
Yeah, she actually advocated bombing, if I'm not correct.
Yeah.
So, that was it's kind of... It wasn't out there, but I think it's indicative of her her sort of, I think, maybe humanitarian interventionist impulse.
Well, I think it's that she will get incredibly frustrated if people are dying, if people are getting hurt, and the politics are getting in the way of solving them. And I think a lot of Americans feel that way as well.
Indeed. Well, anything else? Seems like we'll sort of have to revisit some of these issues, like you said, a year from now or less, and see where things like law of the sea and fair going forward. But
I'd say if we were to come back a year from now, we will see a ratified law of the sea.
Predictions.
Perhaps one other multilateral convention. Beyond that, we'll see some significant U.S. progress and leadership in terms of a new international climate change protocol in a very positive way. I think we'll see that. I believe that we will see a situation where we are, by and large, caught up and on times in terms of our dues and our assessments for the UN. And we'll see a United States that is much more engaged, not just as a superpower, but a super partner, much more willing to work multilaterally with other nations and willing to take a much stronger leadership role than it's taken working together with other nations in the past.
So these are predictions. This is going on the record. They don't edit.
That's
They don't
right.
edit these things, Don.
A year from now,
Yeah.
you and I let's look back and we'll see how well I did on this. But I'm feeling pretty confident about that because it's what needs to happen.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we are at a point in our world. If nothing, this global financial crisis has shown how interconnected we are. You know, just how much our different nations around the world and peoples around the world really count on each other and really need to work together. And some of these critical problems, climate change and nuclear proliferation, as well as finance, you know, we can't ignore them. They just can't. They're just not going to go away, and no country is going to be able to deal with them individually. And I think we have a very pragmatic and smart administration that's coming in that understands it, that gets this, and will work very, very hard to move forward in that direction.
So from your mouth to Obama's ears, I say.
Amen.
All right. Thank you so much, Don.
Okay.
And great.